Hello, it's 8 o'clock on Wednesday, and welcome to Thinking Like a Geographer. This is our weekly video broadcast, and this is our last scheduled broadcast. Let me kind of just update you on a few things. One is I'm having some serious connectivity issues on my end, so it's very possible that the video could just cut out. If it does, we will do what we can to get back online. Also, if for whatever reason it's just been very chaotic on our end this week, so it looks like the question link was not really set up for this week. So, tell you what, let's do. Let's go ahead and schedule another broadcast for next week. And I will get with the technical folks and get that set up so we can do another broadcast next week, and that will just kind of just be a general Q&A. We'll spend the first part looking specifically at urbanization questions that didn't really get covered this week through some complications on our end, but we'll take care of that for you. So next week we'll go ahead and set that up so you can have both questions about urbanization and then just some general questions. Hopefully your teacher is moving toward a time of review in class in addition to what we're doing here, and hopefully at some point in the next couple of weeks you'll be looking at a lot of test prep, maybe even a practice test. I know ours is going to be on May 3rd, so we're moving that direction. So let's go ahead and just kind of plan on that and plan on being ready to do a broadcast next week, and I will touch base with the technical folks and make sure we get that set up. Shouldn't be a problem. So, all right. So without any questions to address today, because as I said, slight technical issues on our end, and like I said, we'll fix that. Let's go ahead and I'm checking my email real quick. I'm sorry, and just kind of go over some basic content that you should be familiar with about urbanization. If you look at your textbook, chances are the chapter on urbanization is quite large, and that's probably because of there's a lot of models that are covered in this particular chapter, this particular unit. So this is definitely the most model heavy, and we'll say that, excuse me, models are very important to this unit. So make sure that you are familiar with those models. Let me kind of walk you through some of the major models. And once again, this is a topic that really needs visuals. So as you're looking at this in the future, as you're reviewing this broadcast, you might want to have those models laying beside you or sitting beside you, so that you can kind of see the visual impact of what I'm talking about. So when we look at models, we're looking primarily at North American models of urban development. So if we look at and we're going to kind of look at these in a historical timeline. So for example, we start with what's called the Burgess model, and you'll want to know the multiple names for some of these. So Burgess is also called the concentric zone model, and if you look at Burgess, it looks a lot like the von Thunen model. In fact, they look almost identical. Which makes sense because they make some similar assumptions. While the von Thunen model is looking at rural land use, the Burgess or concentric zone model is looking at urban land use. But some of the same rules apply. And one of the big concepts that we want to continue to be familiar with as we look at these models is the idea of the central business district, or the CBD. A very, very important idea in that it's kind of the focal point of cities, and that will change over time. But we want to understand the way cities change with that idea of the CBD in mind. So just like in the von Thunen model, where you have one central market in the middle, the concentric zone model has the same assumption with one primary central business district downtown. And that CBD is important because that's where there is a confluence of transportation avenues and highways, things like that. There's also going to be a confluence of commercial activity, trade, and other economic activities in the CBD of traditional models. And so what this means is that real estate at the center of the model is incredibly valuable and incredibly expensive. So expensive that it's very difficult for individual residents to own property in the central business district. It's just too expensive. So what ends up happening is that in order to conserve that valuable land and to maximize the number of people who can live in it, you'll see cities building up. So this is where we see, especially in the West and in North America, skyscrapers, very tall buildings, apartment buildings that are 10, 12, 20 stories tall. The idea being that it has a small footprint in terms of the actual square footage of land that it's filling, but it actually allows them to build up and get much more density out of that. That also helps to spread the land value or land cost around and make it somewhat more manageable for some, and keyword there is some, residential activity to go on there. Most of what happens in terms of who and what is going on in the CBD are large companies, corporate headquarters, things like that, because they can afford that land value and they can spread that cost of building and owning land over a much broader customer base and things like that. So most of your CBD is not residential, or at least not single-family residential. It may be multifamily. So when we start talking about single-family residential, so a house with a yard and a picket fence and a dog and a swing set or whatever, that's going to be much further out, because as you move out from the CBD, land value decreases, and therefore it becomes more manageable and affordable for individuals or families to own a reasonable amount of land. So the concentric zone model starts with this assumption of the CBD being in the district, being in the center, with its economic weight and economic potential, and then as time goes on, you see the development of these different rings. So of different types of economic activities. So you might have the next ring out might be like a light industrial ring, and then maybe a heavy industrial ring, and then a light commercial, or so on and so forth, until the outer rings of the model are where we see actual residential living going on. And that's something to keep in mind, this general pattern of where people live relative to their space needs and what they can afford. So that's kind of Burgess, and Burgess is a model, a late 19th century, early 20th century model, and the important thing about all these models is the role of transportation. What role does transportation play in determining the shape and distribution of different things, different types of land use? So the next model, kind of chronologically, is called the sector model, also called the Hoyt model. The sector model takes that Burgess model, and if you overlay like pie pieces, so like little triangles, where the narrow part of the triangle is connected to the CBD, and then it widens out as you move further out, and you may have 3 or 4 of these. And each of these triangles will be dominated by a particular type of economic activity or particular type of land use, usually industrial land use. Some lower class commercial or industrial, or I'm sorry, lower class residential. And the reason why this happens, and this develops in the 19-teens, 1920s, and into the 1930s, we see this as we see the development and increase in the use of railroads and industrialization. So rail lines are fixed; they don't move, and so businesses, especially industry, wants to locate near those rail lines in order to have access to very heavy industrial products such as steel, iron, coal, chemicals, things like that that come in and out on the rail lines. So along the rail lines, you see these wedge-shaped sectors develop, because that's where the industrial activity is. So if you look at the Hoyt model, you'll see these, and if you were to overlay the Hoyt model with some transportation grids, you would probably very quickly notice a correlation there. Once again, there is some residential here, but it's lower class residential in that people who can afford who can afford it do not live near industrial plants and things like that. It's dirty, it's loud, it's just not necessarily a hospitable place. So the residential areas around these wedges and in these in the sector model, or I'm sorry, the sector model tend to be lower class. The next model I think is one of the more interesting models because it kind of represents this fundamental shift in kind of city distribution, and it's something that you could see very nicely, I think, in cities that in the U.S. that developed later. So if you look at cities like Dallas, where I live, or cities like Atlanta, cities like Phoenix. You see kind of this different model. And what happens in the 1930s and then increasing into the 1940s and 50s, we see the development of what's called the multi-nuclei model. And the multi-nuclei model, historically, I think is very interesting. And so if we go back to the 1940s and the 1950s especially, what we begin to see is a huge demographic shift. A shift from where people lived, their incomes changing, this huge movement that has a huge impact on cities. And what we begin to see in the 1940s and 50s, especially the late 40s, is the development of suburbs. So it used to be that we had cities and urban areas, and then outside those urban areas would be basically rural land used for agriculture and things like that. And so what begins to happen in the 1940s and 50s is this kind of edge development where there's a huge increase in the number of homes being built in close proximity to each other on the edges of cities, away from what was thought of as kind of this harsh, cold, industrial, commercial kind of place, to a place that's a little more idyllic, or a little more, the vision of what America, or the vision of what home should be. And then it's interesting how this change occurs. Now, once again, this change was gradually happening over time, but the major shift happens, as I said, in the 1940s and 1950s, and this change basically occurs after World War II. So a little bit of history lesson here. Most of you probably know most of this, but I'm going to throw it in there anyway. So during World War II, we see this massive mobilization of the economy around the war to support the military. We have all kinds of rationing going on, so families are not having access to consumer goods in the same ways. We're having industries stop making commercial goods or consumer goods and begin to create things for the military. My wife's grandmother, for example, moved to the big city for them, which was Columbus, Ohio, and actually worked in a plant making airplanes in the 1940s during World War II. So anyway, we see this huge mass mobilization of the economy towards fighting the war. The problem with this mass mobilization is that in addition to the economic needs at home to supply the war, you had to have a large number of men who leave the private workforce, and actually go into the military themselves to fight. So what this means is we have to do all of this production, make all of these things, parachutes, planes, tanks, bombs, whatever, but the workforce that would usually be making those things is not available because they are busy doing other things, aka fighting the Nazis and fighting in Japan. So in order to make this happen, we see a mass mobilization and a mass movement of women leaving traditional home kind of work environments, traditional homemaking, traditional non-public kind of working, and then moving into the workforce in large numbers. It's women that do a lot of the production in the factories and things like that during the 1940s. Okay? All right, so now we have the big chunk of men who are fighting the war, and a big chunk of everybody else who's fighting at home through industrial production. yada yada yada, blah 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 blah. 1945, the war ends. Okay, August 8th, Japan, or August 10th, Japan surrenders and the war is over. Yay, we're all happy and excited about that. It's great, right? The evil Nazis are gone. You know, the evil Japanese imperialists are gone. Great. Here's the problem, though, is that when the war is over, there is no longer need for the same amount of production. There's a lot less production that needs to happen. So there's fewer stuff being manufactured. The economy is going to shift back to consumer goods as opposed to military goods. But the problem is that now we have way too many workers. One, because of this shifting away and shrinking of the manufacturing sector, but also because we have all of these women who are in the workforce, and we're adding to that all of these men that are coming back from the war and therefore need jobs. Now, it is a horribly unfortunate thing and part of our kind of history as, well, human beings, really, unfortunately, that when these decisions have to be made about who has to make sacrifices, women often make some of those sacrifices. It's not fair, but that's just kind of the way it is. So as men are coming home, women begin to leave the workforce, and there were several reasons for this. But the most prominent one was this idea that now that the war is over, now that everyone is safe, it's time to start families. Because most of these soldiers were fairly young, most of their wives were fairly young, and so, I mean, this was a natural order of things, the natural stage in their life, and there's nothing wrong with that. So these women were being pushed out of the workforce to make room for men. The problem is now we have a large group of people coming back from war, and they're going to start families. Where are we going to put them? So part of the kind of the marketing and the message and this word sounds bad and it's not intended to, but the propaganda that comes out during the 1940s and 1950s is kind of about the greatness of domestic life, the greatness of having a family, owning a house, having the white picket fence with the dog and the 4 or 5 children, all of those things. And all those things are great, right? They're wonderful. We all like those things, right? The problem is that that's really not going to happen in urban centers. But nor can most people afford to live way out in the country. One, you're isolated from where the jobs are in the cities, and you simply just don't have the infrastructure out there to support large numbers. So what happens is suburbanization. Large numbers of homes being built on the edges of cities, a mass movement of people from the cities to these what we call suburbs in order to create more this massive population shift. Right? This is where we see a lot of what we call the Cold War generation, what we call the baby boom generation from the 1945 to about 1962. All this huge population boom, this huge increase in the number of children being born in the U.S. And a lot of these people are trying, if they're able to move out to the edges of these urban centers, to these suburbs. So these suburbs get larger and larger and larger as families get larger and larger. So how does this relate to models? Well, this is when we begin to see the development of what we call the multi-nuclei model. And the multi-nuclei model develops because as people begin to move out, as they move away from the city center, so do supports, so do industries or businesses that would serve those people, so do some jobs and things like this. So we see one central business district, but the influence of that CBD begins to diminish during this time as more economic activity is being spread around, is happening in different places that are further away in order to support this population movement and this change in the population distribution. So the multi-nuclei model happens because of that. Another important next stage that kind of happens, and this kind of happens in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and is even happening today. Once again, the multi-nuclei model and this next one, which we call the urban realms model, are kind of associated with emerging metropolitan areas in new places. So the South and the West, where land was cheap, where land was plentiful, where you didn't have already developed infrastructure that would be incredibly expensive to move or change. So think of Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, LA is a good example of this. Anyway, so the next kind of stage in this evolution is what we call the urban realms model. And the urban realms model, the CBD becomes even less significant and influential. And once again, we see the development of these kind of self-sustaining communities on the edge of these areas. So if you were going to go to Los Angeles, for example, Los Angeles proper is actually relatively small, but the greater Southern California, LA metro area is this massive, sprawling place with city after city after city after city that are kind of self-sustaining and self-serving. So you've got Pasadena, you've got Anaheim, you've got Inglewood, you've got Pomona and Irvine and all these different cities that are around this kind of central corridor. If you go to Phoenix, you've got places like Mesa and Chandler and all these little smaller cities on the edge that people don't have to travel to the CBD hardly at all anymore. If you live in one of these urban realms kind of cities, because these little edge communities, these little urban realms on the outside really do provide everything that you need. The other important characteristic of this is, as time goes on, more and more and more of what used to be in a CBD is relocating. So as people are moving, people begin to get less and less content to spend so much time commuting. They would rather spend more time working or at home. And so businesses will actually begin to relocate from the central business district out to some of these urban realms communities. And companies are very happy to do this because the less time that their employees spend driving or commuting, the more time they can have to work. So in addition to saying, well, I can spend more time at home, they can also spend more time working. So as this trend continues, the CBD continues to kind of become less influential and more. If you live here in Dallas, so think about all of the little communities around Dallas or around Fort Worth, the two kind of big urban centers of the area. So you've got your Plano, your Frisco, your Richardson, your DeSoto, your Arlington, your mid-cities, all of these places are kind of this urban realms kind of idea. So those are kind of the way that those models kind of progress. And there are other models that you'll come across. You'll come across world cities or galactic models and things like that. And when we start talking about the interconnectedness and globalization of urbanization, how that works is when some of those models come into play. But those are the traditional models, and that's the traditional timeline. Now, here's the next step of that story. While we haven't seen a significant shift in the models, what we are seeing is a significant shift in the demographics. And that is, for the last, 30 years or so, urban centers have become more popular. And we've begun to see a movement of certain groups of individuals from the suburbs back to the city center. And this is very interesting for several reasons. One is, there are very specific groups that would be attracted to living in these city centers, okay? And basically, the drawbacks to living in these city centers is, one, is it's very expensive to live there. Two, you only have certain types of services and certain types of jobs in these city centers. The other kind of big piece of this is what does the education or school system look like in these inner city areas or these urban areas as opposed to the suburbs, right? So what's going to happen is we're going to see people moving back who, one, don't have children for the most part, because one, the more people you have in your family, the more room you need, and in the city center, the more room you need, the cost goes up dramatically. So if you have a family and you have lots of people in your household, you're more likely to live in the suburbs. So if you're moving back, you're more likely to be single. Okay. Also, urban centers attract certain types of cultural things that have a very high threshold and range. And I don't know if we talked about this last time, but threshold talks about the number of people necessary to sustain the type of business. Range is how far are they willing to travel. All right. So urban centers tend to attract things that have a very high threshold and a very high range. So, for example, urban centers are going to have things like art museums or classical music venues or major sports teams that are located in places where they can draw in lots of people because they need to do that. Okay, so for example, if you live in Dallas, where I live, you can look at the Arts District, where you've got the Myerson Symphony Center, and you've got the AT&T Performing Arts Center, and you've got the Dallas Museum of Art, you've got Clive Warren Park, you've got all these kind of the new Perot Museum. You have all these kind of things downtown that, in order to stay functioning, must have a very high threshold and very high range. Now, if you have, so there's very specific types of things that you do for entertainment in these areas. You're also going to be likely to find more entertainment geared towards younger people. So you might find more nightclubs, more bars, more things that are going to be targeted towards young adults, not kid-friendly necessarily. So basically, if that's your lifestyle, okay, if you have no children, if you have the desire to be involved with these types of social activities, if you are a young executive who works in one of these buildings that's still at the city center, then moving back to the city center may be something that's desirable for you. So what we've seen over the course of the last 30 years are these people moving back. And we kind of classify these people in a couple of ways. One is with the acronym SINKS, SINKS, which stands for Single Income No Kids. Single income, but it's really the no kids part that's significant to this movement trend. And we also have a group called DINKS, Dual Income No Kids. Same thing, just with an extra person. So they have more disposable income, less income tied into child rearing and the costs that go along with that. Guess what, guys? You are really, really expensive. All right, and that's why my wife and I don't have kids, but we just have a big old bag of cash. No, not really. But so this idea of single income or dual income, no kids. Now, here's the other side, the additional point of this. These people who are moving back are accustomed to a certain lifestyle. They have disposable income. They're not going to want to live in a rundown, abandoned, crime-ridden, low-income inner city. That's not where they're going to want to live. So several things are going to happen. Either we're going to see some processes of urban renewal where cities go in and build and rebuild and tear down and kind of redevelop areas of the city to attract more of these people. Once again, if you live in Dallas, think of areas like Victory Park, where the Mavericks and the Stars play, right around that area. That 20 years ago, that was a heavily industrial area that has been completely redone by the city and some investors to make it kind of this high-end residential kind of place. The other process is a process known as gentrification, and that is slowly, over the course of many, many years, more and more people move themselves to these areas and begin to slowly rebuild it and slowly revitalize it and rehab it. They may move into old houses and restore them, clean them up, remodel them, make them more desirable to people of higher income brackets. So what we see is these areas of cities that had become run down, that had become fallen into disrepair, had maybe gotten a bad reputation, whether it's just or not, begin to change over time. And this process is kind of driven by these sinks and dinks. Okay, now the last point that I want to make about this is it's not like these areas were completely abandoned. It's not like nobody lived there before. So when all these people start moving back, then the question is, what happens to the people that live there? Because as people rehab these areas, as they are redeveloped, as they are remodeled, as they are improved, the property value is going to go up, rent's going to go up, insurance is going to go up, and it makes it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for these two groups to live together, because the people that did live there can no longer afford to live there. So one of the negative side effects of gentrification, from a social perspective, is it pushes out people from their homes, forces people to move someplace else. So what we see is over time is as these areas become redeveloped, we just kind of see the movement of these lower income folks who are kind of struggling, this constant transient movement. They almost become kind of semi-nomadic over time. As these different areas become too pricey for them or too expensive, they have to find someplace else. So this is kind of the downside of that, is that there's always going to be this group of people that can't afford to keep up with the gentrification process, and what do we do with them? Okay, all right. So keep those things in mind. On that last note about that conflict between gentrification and the residents that have been there, there's a very good documentary that came out a few years ago that takes place in my wife's hometown of Columbus, Ohio, in a part of town called Victorian Village. Victorian Village has a lot of, as the name says, kind of 19th century Victorian homes that over time had fallen into disrepair. The documentary is about the conflict that arose when people began to gentrify, and the conflicts that it caused. And the movie is called Flag Wars. It's kind of hard to find, but it's a very, very good documentary. If you have time and are just bored, you should watch it. But anyway, so that's kind of that process and how those kind of urban things happen. While we are still on the topic of models, it's important to remember that the models that you're looking at the most are going to be North American models for the most part. European cities they're very old. They're very old, and so they kind of don't follow the same patterns. Their patterns were established in some cases 1,000 years ago, and so they're not going to follow the same types of things. But the other kind of interesting kind of trends and pattern is the rate of and patterns of urbanization in the developing world, especially looking at places like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. And one of the things that we see there is kind of an opposite trend. While in these North American models, the higher income folks, the wealthier folks, tend to gravitate outward and live on the outer edges as much as possible, away from what they perceive as dirty or harsh or cold, in a aesthetic way, not in an actual temperature way. Cities. In the developing world, the opposite is true. The wealthier, higher income folks live in the middle, live downtown, live near the CBD. And the poorest of the poor, many times they're squatters. Squatting means that you just find a piece of ground and you live on it, whether you have permission or not. They tend to live on the outer edges of the city. Part of this has to do with kind of differences in some cultural things in terms of walkability and mass transit, kind of things like that. But the really interesting thing about this is these squatter settlements, especially places like Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Mexico City. Just you have this massive numbers of people moving to the city because they perceive the city as having opportunities that they don't have elsewhere, and that's true. I mean, we've already talked about that. There is a perception that when we talked about migration, we talked about people migrate to cities because opportunities are there, and there may be more opportunities than there is where they are. However, there's never enough opportunities for the number of people moving. So thousands and thousands and millions and millions and millions of people in the developing world are taking part in this rural to urban migration, and they're filling in the outer edges of these cities with these massive squatter settlements where people just basically, I'm going to live here. They grab whatever they can find, cardboard, plastic, old cars, whatever to live in. The biggest problem is that building cities is expensive. It's not easy. And building the infrastructure to make cities functional and operational is also very, very expensive. So building roads, building proper sewage and sanitation, building proper access to fresh water, developing an economic base to support this mass migration, developing an educational system to support this mass migration, happens very, very slowly and is very, very expensive. So these people are moving to the cities at a much, 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 much faster rate than the cities can keep up and support them. And so those are some things to keep in mind. The other thing is that people often are living in areas that are geologically or geographically marginal. So you may have people living on the sides of mountains, and you may have people living in geologically unstable areas. A few years ago, there was a big mudslide in Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, one or the other, that kind of, the side of the mountain just kind of slid off. And in the process, this mountain was covered with thousands and thousands of these little squatter settler homes, and so thousands of people were killed because a heavy rain washed all their homes away, because they were built where people could find to build a place to build or a place to live, and they were built with substandard materials and construction because they're building with what they could find. Anyway, so these trends are happening all over the developing world. If you look at the list of top 10 cities in 1975, and you look at the same list in 2015, which is next year, what you see is most of the developed world cities have dropped off that top 10 list and been replaced by places like Jakarta, Mumbai, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, Lagos, Nigeria, places like this. And so these are the largest urban centers in the world, and are growing very, very, very rapidly. And there are some serious consequences to that. Okay. So urban models, very, very important. Urbanization, suburbanization, trends, movements, things like that. Land distribution, some of those kind of trends are important. What are the overall global trends in some of those things? Another concept to remember is, and this kind of gets back to our discussion last week of Christaller, and that in North America and in relatively young developed countries, so not Europe, so not Western Europe, we have this thing called the rank size rule. And the rank size rule is kind of this formula that fairly accurately depicts the size of cities. And basically what it says, and this once again follows some of Christaller's ideas, is that every city is proportionately large or small to other cities. Does that make sense? So you have city number 1, the largest city in a country. Okay, proportionally, city number 2 is going to be proportionally sized to that. So if and kind of the rule is that city number 2 is half the size of city 1. That city number 3 is a third the size of city number 2. That of city number 1. That the fourth city is 1/4 or 1/4 the size of city number 1. So this idea that there is a proportionality to the size of cities and the distribution of these cities. So if you were to look at New York versus Chicago versus LA versus some of those kind of distributions. Now this applies, as I said, to kind of North American cities more than anything else. When you move out of North America, you often see what's called the primate city rule. The primate city rule is that this distribution is not equal, it is not even, that most of the economic and social capital and cultural capital is concentrated into one large city within a country, which means that's also where people are going to continue to move. So you can look at Mexico City, you can look at Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, you can look at all these kinds of cities and see that they are significantly large. So you may have, for example, London, which is developed, but once again is very, very old, and has and developed and grew before it was considered economically developed. So London has like 9 million people. The next largest has like 2, like Manchester or Birmingham, one or the other. Has like 2 million people. Paris has 9 million people. Marseille has 2 million. So it's not proportional. It's a huge gap between this. The downside of this primate city is that depending on the size of your country, you're concentrating everything into fewer and fewer and fewer places in terms of cultural and economic power, which leaves a huge imbalance and uneven distribution of those things. So you'll have regions of the country that are incredibly poor and incredibly culturally underdeveloped, and you'll have some areas that have all of those things. And so that's not necessarily good. And in a country like England, it's not that big a deal. It's not very big. So everything emanating out of London is fine. France, kind of the same thing. Just because they're developed. But if you go to the developing world, where that has a much bigger impact. Okay, I haven't talked about very many topics today because I really spent a lot of time on those models because they're really important. I don't understand why so many geographers are interested in this. I think it's fascinating, but it's really a big concept. When you're at the reading, when I'm at the reading and I'm talking to people, talking to some of the college professors that are there, almost to a man, they have done some kind of urbanization research. So it's a very important concept for the test, and these models are especially important. So continue to look over your urbanization stuff. I will get together with the technical folks at the end of the broadcast today and see if we can get some a question link set up for urbanization, which once again we dropped the ball on that, so we'll fix that. Also, next week, going to try to have just some general Q&A time for your questions, and then after the end of that, we're going to kind of wrap up and kind of wish you luck at that point. So, so anyway, 45 minutes in. I wish I had talked about more topics, but models are what it's all about with urbanization. So. With that being said, I'm going to sign off and look for the links for next week. All right, thanks. Bye.